You are 38 years old, but your spine feels like rotted timber. For 19 winters, your entire world has been the biting leather of a shoulder strap, the animal roar of men dying 3 feet from your face, and the iron stink of blood drying on your forearms. You have walked distances no merchant would believe. Your hips grind when you stand. Your dreams are a slaughterhouse on repeat, and every inch of skin you own carries a scar, with a story you cannot tell anyone. You have no wife the law recognizes, no son who can inherit your name, no patch of dirt that calls itself yours. You are not a person. You are a sharpened tool that breathes, and tools do not get old. They get replaced. Then, on a gray morning near the edge of the empire, a tribune presses a thin bronze plaque into your hand. He claps your shoulder, watches a slave pull the armor off your back, and tells you the state has no further use for your body. You step past the wooden gate and into a silence that has no shape. Your heart slams against your throat, and in that instant, the truth arrives, late and brutal. Rome did not liberate you. Rome simply switched you off. You can gut a screaming Gaul before he finishes his war cry. You cannot, for the life of you, remember how to eat a meal that isn't rationed. This is the part of the Roman Empire that the marble statues refuse to talk about. Every textbook wants to worship the eagles on the standards, the cold brilliance of Caesar's campaigns, the white columns of the Forum glowing at dusk. Nobody wants to open the door at the back of the slaughterhouse. Nobody wants to count the men who came out the other side. Because what do you do with the leftovers of the most disciplined killing operation the ancient world ever built? What happens to the hands when the war is finally done with them? This is the story Rome paid scribes to forget. The story of the men who carried the empire on their backs, conquered 3 continents in its name, and then died barefoot, half-mad, and unrecognized on the same temple steps their blood had purchased. Tell me in the comments down below which city and country you are watching from right now. Take a moment to subscribe to support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The year is 107 BC. Rome stinks of damp wheat going sour in the warehouses and the greasy smoke of cheap cooking fires. A slow bleed is killing the Republic, and nobody in the Senate wants to name it out loud. For generations, the Roman war machine had rested on one unspoken rule. You could only wear the armor if you owned the dirt. A man with a farm, the elders said, would bleed harder on the field because there was something of his own waiting at the end of the road. It was a clean idea. It worked when wars ended before harvest. It collapsed the moment Rome stopped fighting its neighbors and started swallowing the Mediterranean whole. The men were shipped across the sea: Hispania, Greece, Africa. Some never came back for 4, 5, 7 years. Their fields rotted into weeds. Their wives begged grain from distant cousins. Their children grew up learning their father's name from a clay bust on a shelf. And while the soldier was away, the men with silver in their cellars began a quiet, merciless harvest of their own. The wealthy bought up the abandoned plots for coins on the denarius. They bulldozed the little family farms and stitched them together into enormous estates worked entirely by chained slaves taken in the very wars the veterans had fought. So the veterans came home to nothing. No home, no plot, no trade. They drifted toward the city like smoke pulled toward a chimney and joined a new social class the Romans barely had a word for: the capite censi, the head count. Men who owned no property, so the census counted only their skulls. They had their skin and nothing else. And the Republic, hungry for landowners to fill its shield walls, was running dry. Then the northern sky split open. The Cimbri and the Teutones came down through the passes, tens of thousands of men, women, children, wagons, livestock, a migrating nation bristling with iron. At Arausio in 105 BC, they met a Roman army on the banks of the Rhone and did not leave survivors. 80,000 legionaries dead in a single afternoon. The ground went red for miles. Rome had no army left. The Senate chamber reeked of sweat and panic. They needed warm bodies. They needed them yesterday, so they turned to a rough provincial politician named Gaius Marius. Marius walked through the slums of the Subura and did not see beggars. He saw raw material. He climbed the rostra in the forum and spoke past the senators directly to the poorest men in the city. I will feed you. I will clothe you. I will arm you. You will march, and you will kill. And when the killing is done, I will hand you a parcel of land you can pass to your sons. The starving men stared up at him like hunted animals hearing the word mercy for the first time. They stepped forward, and in that step, without knowing it, they snapped the spine of the Republic. Because these men did not love Rome. Rome had never fed them. Rome had never noticed them. They loved the man who filled their bowl. They raised their right hands and took the sacramentum, the military oath, a binding with religious weight that dissolved their rights as citizens. A Roman citizen had a right to trial. A Roman soldier had the right to die where his general pointed. His commander could flog him, crucify him, starve him, behead him, and answer to no magistrate for any of it. He was no longer a person protected by law. He was state property with a pulse. The conversion from man to instrument began the moment the gates closed behind them. The Marian reforms standardized everything. The state stamped out helmets by the thousand, curved rectangular shields, a heavy javelin, a short stabbing sword built for close work, and then the pack. Each man strapped a wooden yoke across his shoulders and hung his entire existence from it. Iron rations, a bronze cooking pot, a hand mill for grinding grain, an entrenching tool, 2 sharpened stakes for the nightly wall. The load pressed down around 40 kilograms. They marched with it across mountain passes, frozen rivers, salt flats, and swamps. They mocked themselves with a bitter nickname, Marius's Mules. 20 miles a day, every day. Whether the men were sick, hungry, or bleeding, the pace did not care. When the sun dropped, the real work began. A Roman army did not sleep under the open sky. A Roman army built a city every night and tore it down at dawn. The packs came down, the picks came up, men cut a deep ditch around the chosen ground. The dirt piled into an embankment. The sharpened stakes went into the top of the embankment to form a spiked palisade. Gates, watch posts, officer tents laid out in the exact same pattern as the night before, and the night before that, and the night before that. They did this in driving rain with numb fingers. They did this while enemy scouts picked off the stragglers. Their palms split open and scabbed over and split again until the skin became something closer to saddle leather. Only when the walls were sealed did the centurion let them eat. Dinner was a rock-hard biscuit of twice-baked bread and a strip of salted pork boiled into the broth. They drank posca, vinegar thinned with water. The acid killed whatever was breeding in the local stream. They slept 8 to a tent of oiled calfskin. This was the contubernium, the smallest unit of Roman military life. 8 men, 1 mule, 1 hand mill, 1 pot, 1 tent. They slept pressed against each other like animals in a den. They learned the cough of the man on their left, and the nightmare whimper of the man on their right. It was an engineered intimacy, deliberate, almost surgical, designed to replace the families these men had walked away from. The tent became the father. The tent became the wife. The tent became the son. Discipline was not a rule. It was a climate. The Roman command understood a single, ugly truth. A soldier must fear his own officers more than he fears the enemy. The centurion carried a gnarled vine staff called a vitis, and he used it like a farmer uses a whip on a tired ox. If a sentry dozed at his post, the punishment was the fustuarium. The tribune would touch him on the shoulder with a white rod. His own cohort would surround him, and his own tent mates, the men who had shared his pot and his blanket for years, would beat him to death with stones and clubs. It was execution by community. It forced the legion to police its own bones. If an entire cohort broke and ran, the punishment was worse. Decimation. The unit was broken into groups of 10, and each group drew lots from a helmet. The man with the marked stone was condemned. His 9 comrades were ordered to kill him with their bare hands and whatever rocks they could find. They were forced to murder the man who had held them when they cried for their mothers in their first year of service. There was no appeal. There was no absolution. This was not punishment as we understand it. This was neurological rewiring. It burned the last traces of civilian morality out of the human brain. It taught the legionary a lesson deeper than any drill. You do not mourn the dead. You close the gap in the line. You move on. The body paid the real price, and it paid it in installments. The iron rings of the chainmail dragged down on the shoulders year after year until the traps thickened into stiff ropes. The weight compressed the vertebrae. The hobnailed sandals gripped the earth beautifully, but every footfall sent a dull shock through the shin and up into the hip. After a few thousand miles, the bones of the feet developed tiny stress fractures that never healed. The cartilage in the knees was ground to paste. Bone grated on bone. By 30, a veteran walked like a grandfather. His chest was armor. His thighs were carved stone. But the scaffolding inside him was collapsing. Then there was combat itself. Ancient battle was not the wild scrum the poets described. It was an assembly line for killing men. The legion held its formation. The enemy charged, screaming, banging weapons against shields, trying to crack the Roman nerve with noise. At 20 paces, the front rank released their javelins in a single disciplined volley. The pilum was an engineered betrayal. It punched through a wooden shield, and then the soft iron neck behind the point bent on impact. The enemy could not yank it free. The weight of it dragged his shield down. And now he was exposed. Now the Roman line advanced, in silence, in step. A wall of painted wood moving forward like a single creature with one mind. They punched with the metal boss of the shield. The impact broke noses, shattered jaws, crushed sternums. The enemy staggered back half a step. The legionary stepped into the small opening and thrust his short sword up, low, into the soft belly below the ribs. He twisted the blade, ripping the wound wider, making sure the bleeding was something nobody could stop. He pulled the sword free. He stepped over the folding body. He did it again. It was not fury. It was not hatred. It was piecework. The air in the middle of the line turned into a hot fog of copper and bile. Men slipped on their own intestines. The noise was a wall of bronze on wood, of men calling for gods who were not listening, of wet, dying sounds that stayed in the ear for decades. Living through the fight was only the first test. The aftermath was its own slow horror. Roman field surgeons were the best in the known world, and they worked with bloody hands in unwashed tents. If a Gallic longsword took a man's arm off above the elbow, the surgeon pinched the spraying artery, pressed a glowing iron bar against the stump, and the soldier either went into shock and died or woke up a cripple. Arrowheads were pulled with bronze spreaders built specifically to grip the barbs. The wounds were rinsed with vinegar and packed with spider silk to force the blood to clot. There were no antibiotics, none. A shallow cut from a rusty edge could kill a man in under a week. The skin around the wound would purple, then blacken, then begin to smell like fruit gone bad in the sun. The fever would rise. The man would shake in his bedroll. His tent mates would sit on the ground next to him, not speaking, passing a skin of wine back and forth, waiting for the rattle in his chest to stop. Sepsis was a long and undignified death, and the survivors saw it happen over and over again. They learned to let their faces go still. They learned to drink until the images blurred. They stared at the fire until the centurion called them back to work. Years bled into other years. The banners moved from Gaul to Pontus, to Syria, to the edges of Parthia. And the bargain Marius had struck in a moment of national panic began to warp into something the old Senate never could have predicted. The generals noticed, slowly at first, and then all at once, that their veterans were not loyal to the state. Their veterans were loyal to them. In 88 BC, a general named Lucius Cornelius Sulla did the unthinkable. He ordered his legions to march on Rome itself. Roman law forbade any armed force from crossing the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. It was not a rule, it was a taboo that predated memory. The soldiers marched anyway. They did not care about the Pomerium. They cared about the coin in the pay chest. They poured into the streets and hunted political enemies through the forum. They set the wooden tenements burning. They proved, in a single afternoon, that the Republic was already a ghost. Power had left the Senate House years ago. Power lived now in the hands of whoever controlled the grain supply of the veterans. The legions had become a traveling army of armed dependents. The generals were no longer public servants. They were warlords in borrowed togas. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, he was not inventing anything. He was reading from a script Sulla had written 4 decades earlier. The Republic was not murdered in a day. It was strangled slowly by the men it had once refused to feed. When a campaign finally ended, the bill arrived, and nobody wanted to pay it. The veterans demanded the land they had been promised on the rostra 20 years earlier. The Senate refused. There was no more public land in Italy. The rich had bought it all. They were not going to give up their slave plantations to settle a few thousand broken old soldiers. So the generals did what generals always do when the state fails. They took. They stripped farms from political enemies. They cleared entire villages in the provinces. They handed these stolen parcels to their men and called it a discharge package. The paperwork was a bronze tablet called a diploma. The veteran folded it into his tunic. He packed what little he still owned. He began the long, limping walk to a place on the map he had never seen. 20 years of killing. Ambushes in the pine forests of Germania, where the fog made every shadow look like a spear. Dysentery in Judea that emptied a man into his own sandals. Fingers missing from a bad parry in Thrace. Hearing half destroyed by years of cavalry thundering past the shield wall. A chest you could read like a book if you knew how to follow scar tissue. And in the pocket of his tunic, a small piece of bronze that was supposed to make all of it worth the cost. This was the moment the story he had told himself for 2 decades began to crack. Before we walk with these men to the end of their road, I need to ask something of you directly. You are still here, which means you already understand what this channel actually is. History is not a parade of dates. History is a long, careful accounting of what it costs to be human. If you want to go deeper into the dark with us, join The Lineage, our exclusive channel membership. Joining is not a tip. It is patronage. You are funding the long hours of reading old texts that nobody reads anymore, so that stories like this one can reach your screen. Members of The Lineage get early access to our most brutal documentaries and walk at the front of this community. If you feel like one of us, click the join button below. Keep these buried stories breathing. The veteran reached the coordinates written on his tablet. He stood at the edge of a property line under a sun that did not feel like Italian sun. The land in front of him was not the green field he had dreamed about during every cold night in Gaul. It was a slope of broken limestone and dry thorn. The dirt was gray. It would not feed a goat. It would not hold a plow. Or worse, the coordinates led him to a real farm, green and tended, where an allied Italian family stood in the doorway holding children and looking at him the way he had once looked at condemned villages. The general had drawn a line on a map in a tent in Rome. Nobody had told the family living on the other side of that line. The veteran stood there with the bronze tablet in one hand. He had no plow. He had no seed. He had no ox. He had no neighbors. He had a sword that had been cleaned so many times the edge was a thin gray crescent. And standing on that hillside, in the silence he had been waiting 20 years to hear, the last illusion finally broke apart in his chest. The Senate had not given him a peaceful retirement. The Senate had handed him a second war and called it a reward. His whole life had been a trade. He was a tool, and the men who had used him were finished with him, and now he was supposed to use himself to take from a family weaker than he was. He let the pack slide off his shoulder into the dust. He looked at the family in the doorway. He looked at the gray, useless dirt. He drew the sword. The Latin tongue was a scalpel. The Romans had a dozen ways to describe the angle at which an aqueduct should fall across a mile. They had exact words for the specific officer who counted grain shipments in a provincial warehouse, and a different one for the officer who counted them at the port. They had legal terms so narrow that modern lawyers still borrow them 2,000 years later. And yet, in that entire ocean of vocabulary, there was not a single word for what happens inside a human skull after 2 decades of killing men at arm's length. When a veteran stared down at the gray, useless soil of his so-called reward, or when he found the village of his boyhood turned to charcoal by some rival senator's private war, he had only one direction left. He turned around. He walked back to the city. He traded the bronze of his cuirass for a rough wool tunic that smelled like somebody else's sweat. He tried to push himself back into a population that had spent the last 20 years pruning olive trees, bartering over the price of salted fish, and arguing in the forum about the boundary of a neighbor's wall. The civilian world did not feel real to him. It felt like a long, detailed dream a dying man has. He moved through the crowded streets of Rome or Capua with the tight, sideways gait of a predator who has been cornered too many times. Everyone around him looked like prey, or worse, like a threat that had not yet declared itself. The disconnect happened first in the ears. In a legionary camp, every sound carried a precise meaning, decoded in under a second. The deep moan of a cornu horn meant the left flank was under pressure. A specific cadence of hobnails on gravel meant the watch was changing. The rhythm of a centurion's vetus tapping against the tent pole meant the morning assembly. Out here, in the civilian world, none of the sounds obeyed any pattern. A blacksmith hammering a horseshoe rang exactly like a sword, striking a shield boss in the front rank. A stray dog barking in an alley at midnight sounded precisely like a Germanic scout giving an ambush signal in the black pine forests beyond the Rhine. A child dropping a clay pot on a stone floor sent the veteran's hand to his hip, reaching for a sword that was no longer there. His body had been rewired for war, and no one, not a doctor, not a priest, not a magistrate, knew how to rewire it back. He rented a cramped cell on an upper floor of an insula, those towering, groaning tenement blocks of the Roman poor that burned down every summer and got rebuilt every autumn. He tried to sleep on the straw mattress they gave him. He could not. The mattress gave under him. It felt like quicksand. For 2 decades, he had slept on hard-packed dirt inside a leather tent, surrounded by 7 men whose breathing he knew by heart, with a ditch and a wooden wall and armed sentries between his body and the night. Now, there was only a thin clay wall and the laughter of strangers through it. The silence of the room closed over him like a lid on a coffin. He moved to the floor. He slept with a rusted knife clutched against his ribs. He woke up screaming, and the tenants on the other side of the wall pounded on it and told him to shut up, and he lay there in the dark with his heart trying to punch its way out of his chest. The nightmares had no demons. The nightmares had dates. The men who had crawled out of the Teutoburg forest in the autumn of AD 9 closed their eyes and saw the same image for the rest of their lives. Centurions' heads nailed at eye level to the trunks of oak trees, the mouths open, the tongues already gone to the crows. The men who had marched into Parthia with Crassus in 53 BC woke in the night, gagging on the dry dust of Carrhae, hearing the terrible singing whistle of arrows coming down in numbers so great they darkened the midday sun. The medical treatises of Celsus and later Galen, for all their sophistication, had no remedy for these visitations. There was no hospital for the mind. Rome did not build one. Rome assumed its machines would rust quietly in some corner. So the veterans built their own medicine. They drifted, night after night, toward the Popinae, the smoky, half-underground wine holes that pressed up against the slums of every Roman city. They were done with Posca. They drank merum, unmixed wine, thick, dark, the kind the patricians called a barbarism because it hit the nervous system like a club. They sat in the back corners with their scarred backs to the stone wall because 20 years had taught them never to sit with their back to a room. They drank to quiet the phantom pain. Men who had lost a hand in Hispania or a foot in Dacia could still feel those missing pieces clenching and twitching in the damp Roman winter. The severed nerves kept firing, kept sending signals to a hand that was, by now, a small pile of yellowed bone in a pit 3 provinces away. They drank until the ghosts of their own bodies finally shut up. The wine bar was a room full of primed explosives, and nobody in the civilian world understood why. A young dockhand, 3 cups in, might stumble against a scarred veteran and throw a casual insult over his shoulder. The kind of remark that, between 2 civilians, would end in shouting and maybe a shove. The veteran did not understand shouting. The veteran did not understand shoving. The Legion had surgically removed, piece by piece, his capacity for proportional response. You do not argue with a threat. You do not posture at a threat. You remove the threat before it becomes a problem. Before the dockhand could take a second breath, the veteran was already moving. A clay wine jug shattered against the side of his head. A calloused thumb driven into an eye socket to the second knuckle. A knee on his throat while the body went limp. The entire sequence took less time than it takes to sing a line of a tavern song. The veteran would step over the body, pay his tab, and walk out into the street while the young man died slowly on the sawdust floor. The city watch, when they came, rarely asked hard questions. You do not arrest the man who broke the shield wall at Mutina. You wait for him to leave, and then you sweep up. For a huge number of these men, going home was never even attempted. They took their bronze discharge tablet, read the coordinates of whatever rock they had been assigned, and walked in the opposite direction. They went straight back to the frontier, to the Canabae. The Canabae were the sprawling, unregulated shanty quarters that grew around every permanent legionary fortress on the border like moss on a north-facing wall. The Canabae were not planned. They were not zoned. They were a parasitic economy that lived entirely off the pay packet of the active legionary. A warren of mud lanes, collapsing timber brothels, illegal gambling pits, and merchants selling fake silver cups to homesick recruits. The veterans chose this place because it was the only ecosystem their nervous systems recognized. They lived under the walls of the fortress. They woke to the familiar dawn trumpet. They listened to the shouted drill commands from the training yard and found, to their own bewilderment, that the sound soothed them. They watched the new recruits stumble through formations they themselves had mastered 20 years earlier. They drank their discharge bonuses down to the last coin. When the coins were gone, they drifted into a slow, public rotting. Syphilis hollowed out their faces. Cirrhosis yellowed their skin. They died in the alleys, half-dressed, thin as kindling, sometimes within sight of the very standard they had sworn to protect with their lives. Let me step out of the narrative for a moment, because what we are reconstructing here is not a general mood. It is the precise anatomy of a psychological collapse, and the granular layer of it does not live inside the standard history textbooks. It lives in the primary sources sitting on the bottom shelves of restricted archives. If you look at your screen right now, you will see the View Products button. Open the shop shelf. The book featured there is a monolithic archive of Roman military trauma. It is the definitive breakdown of what an ancient killing machine does to its own men, and it was the foundational text for this exact script. You need this volume on your shelf if you want to truly understand the scale of the horror we are pulling out of the dirt together. And while you are on the shelf, take a moment to browse the rest. There are a few immersive relics waiting in the vault to finish your dark history collection. Claim your artifacts. Then let's get back to the mud. For a certain class of broken man, even the Canabae was not enough. The isolation was still too deep. The freedom of the civilian world felt like falling through open air with nothing to grab. They missed the camp. They missed the certainty of an officer pointing at a line on the ground and telling them to stand there and die on it. They missed the tent mates. They missed the only family they had ever had. So they made the choice that baffled the civilian world and terrified their own relatives. They walked back, of their own free will, into the meat grinder. They came to the gates of the legionary fortress, showed their honorable discharge tablet to the legate, and asked to be put back on the rolls. The army had a word for them: evocati, the recalled, the called back, and the army took them without a moment's hesitation. A man who has survived 20 years of ancient war is not a soldier. He is an apex animal in human skin. The evocati were exempted from the grinding fatigue duties of the legion. They did not dig ditches. They did not drive stakes. They did not carry water. Their sole job was to stand in the front rank when the charge came, and to kill without hesitation. They negotiated their own contracts, and they usually demanded double pay. But the silver was never the real reason. The real reason was identity. They wore distinctive insignia. Many of them carried a vitis, the vine staff of authority normally reserved for centurions, to mark their elevated status. They were the older brothers of the legion, the ones the new boys watched from the corners of their eyes. When 20,000 screaming Germans poured out of a tree line, and the recruits felt their bowels loosen, they would glance sideways at the evocati, and the evocati would be standing perfectly still, faces blank, eyes dead, waiting with a terrible, patient calm for the enemy to step into range. They chose to die with a sword in their hand in a foreign field because peace was a dialect they had long ago forgotten how to speak. But not every shattered man re-enlisted. By the end of the civil wars, as the smoke of Actium cleared in 30 BC, the new master of the Roman world looked down at his map and saw a problem that no general in the Republic's history had ever had to solve. The young Emperor Augustus, Caesar's calculating heir, counted the numbers and went pale. There were hundreds of thousands of these men, discharged, traumatized, armed, experienced in urban violence, wandering through every city in Italy with nothing in their pockets and nothing left to lose. Augustus understood, with the cold clarity that defined his entire reign, a simple equation. If he did not find a way to sedate these walking ghosts, they would not fade quietly. They would remember who they were. They would remember what they had been taught to do. And they would burn Rome to the ground brick by brick, starting with the Senate. The year is AD 6. The Republic is a corpse. It did not fall in one cinematic afternoon on the steps of the Senate. It bled out slowly, across generations, through civil wars, proscription lists, assassinations in the marble corridors, and the ugly, quiet murders that never made it into the official histories. Out of that long wreckage stood a small, pale man with unremarkable features. Octavian. He rebranded himself as Augustus, the first emperor, and he sat on top of a power structure more absolute than anything the old kings of Italy had ever dreamed of. He controlled the grain ships coming in from Alexandria. He controlled the Senate by controlling who lived to sit in it. He controlled the coin in every purse. But when he unrolled the map of Italy on his desk in AD 6, he saw, written between the lines, a problem that could still end him. The peninsula was crawling with discharged legionaries, hundreds of thousands of them. They had served under every banner of the last 40 years. They had fought for Caesar, and then killed Caesar's assassins. They had fought for Antony, and then been sold out by Antony at Actium. They had fought for Augustus himself, and they remembered. They were old now. Their knees were gone. Their lungs were full of campfire soot and marching dust. But their hands still knew the grip of a sword. Augustus understood a piece of political physics that most emperors after him would forget. A starving civilian will beg in the forum. A starving legionary will organize. He could not pretend they were not there. He could not turn the Praetorian Guard loose on them, because the Praetorians were veterans themselves, and no man raised in the legions will draw steel on another man who once slept in the same tent row. So Augustus did the only thing an emperor in his position could do. He paid for their silence. In AD 6, he established the Aerarium Militare, the imperial military treasury. It was, in the cleaned-up language of modern textbooks, the first state pension system in Western history. A lump sum in cash for every soldier who finished 20 years of service alive. Beautiful on a plaque. In practice, it was institutional hush money wearing the robes of civic virtue. The mechanics of the thing exposed exactly how frightened the imperial court actually was. To fund these payouts, Augustus had to lock in an almost unimaginable river of silver, year after year. He could no longer rely on plunder from fresh conquests, because the borders of the empire were beginning to freeze in place. He had to reach into the pockets of the Roman citizens themselves. He slapped a 5% tax on all inheritances, which fell squarely on the patricians who had expected to pass their estates whole to their sons. He added a 1% tax on the proceeds of every public auction. The noble families of Rome were livid. They were being taxed, in their own minds, to fund the wine bills of unwashed infantrymen who stank of the frontier. Augustus heard their fury and did not blink. He was not trying to be popular with the senators. He was trying to keep sharpened iron out of his own throat. But setting up the fund did not solve the daily reality on the ground. The Roman state was a bureaucratic labyrinth built by men who loved paperwork more than their own wives. A soldier did not simply walk out of camp, raise his tablet to the sky, and receive a bag of silver. He was handed his bronze diploma, folded it into his tunic, and then faced a second war. A paper war. He had to travel on foot, sometimes across entire provinces, to a regional capital, or all the way back to Rome. He had to find the right basilica. He had to find the right office. He had to stand in line with other veterans in various stages of collapse. And eventually, he had to deal with the tabularii, the imperial clerks, the men who ran the archives. Picture the scene. A man who crawled out of the trenches at Alesia with a stripe of scar tissue running from his ear to his collarbone, whose right leg drags behind his left because a Parthian arrow nicked the nerve in his thigh 20 years ago, stands in a cool marble corridor that smells of beeswax and old parchment. He hands his bronze tablet to a young man with soft, unmarked hands, a reed pen tucked behind his ear, and a tunic whiter than any garment the veteran has owned in his entire life. The clerk turns the tablet in his fingers. He compares it against a list on a scroll. He checks the seals. He purses his lips. And if, anywhere in the paper trail, there is a gap, a missing signature, a cohort record destroyed in a fire in some frontier fort, a commanding officer who died in a skirmish before he could sign the discharge endorsement, the clerk slowly shakes his head. The claim is denied. Come back next month with additional witnesses. Next. And the veteran cannot draw his sword. He is inside the basilica. 2 Praetorian guards stand by the doors, fresh-faced and alert, and they will kill him in the courtyard before he reaches the steps. So he swallows it. He walks out. He begins the long appeals process, which drags for months, and in some documented cases, for years. During that entire limbo, the state gives him no housing, no rations, no stipend, nothing. He is turned loose in the most expensive city in the ancient world, with empty pockets and a piece of bronze that everyone agrees is valuable in theory and worthless in practice. The hush money is locked behind a sealed vault door, and he is sleeping on the steps of a temple, eating whatever falls off a baker's cart. The contrast inside the city walls became obscene. Rome in the age of Augustus was drunk on its own wealth. Exotic cargo was coming in daily from every corner of the known world. Wealthy senators were carried through the streets in enclosed wooden litters hoisted on the shoulders of Thracian and Egyptian slaves. They wore silk dyed with Tyrian purple, a color so expensive it was effectively liquid silver. They ate roasted flamingo tongues, dormice stuffed with pine nuts and rolled in honey, oysters packed in snow from the Apennines. They debated Stoic philosophy under shaded porticos, while a slave fanned the flies away from their plates. And directly outside those same porticos, often within a spear's throw of the dining couches, sat the men who had bled to make the silk and the honey possible. They sat in the dirt. They wore woolen rags they had stitched shut themselves. They held out their caps to the passing crowds. Some of them displayed their amputated stumps deliberately, not out of shame, but as a kind of credential, a silent resume. The civilian population did not see them with gratitude. The civilians saw them with a recoiling, visible disgust. The veteran was a walking indictment. He was the physical evidence of what it actually cost to build the empire everyone was enjoying. And so the citizens of Rome learned to cross the street. They learned to suddenly become interested in a shop window. The veteran learned, in the slow and humiliating classroom of the Forum, that Rome loved the idea of the legionary the way Rome loved the idea of a god. In the abstract, at a safe distance, never close enough to smell him. Hunger outlasts pride. The veterans waiting for their pensions, and the ones who had already burned through theirs in a single long bender in the Suburra, needed income now, not in 6 months. The legitimate economy had no slot for them. A blacksmith did not want a 50-year-old apprentice with ruined shoulders. A baker did not want a man whose hands shook too badly to hold a loaf steady. The stevedores at the docks took one look at the limping old killer and waved him off. There was, however, one sector of the civilian economy that looked at a broken veteran and saw pure gold. The criminal underworld. Rome had no police. Read that again. Rome had no police. The urban cohorts and the vigiles existed, but they functioned as a fire brigade and an anti-riot squad for the imperial palace. They did not patrol the alleys of the Suburra. They did not investigate a stabbing behind a tavern. The night streets of Rome were governed by rival political bosses, patrician crime lords, freedmen racketeers who had grown rich off protection rackets, and the gang captains of various factions that fought over the grain markets. These men needed muscle, not ordinary muscle. Serious, disciplined, reliable muscle. And the supply was sitting right there on the temple steps. The transition, for the veteran, was almost frictionless. A man who had once held the 3rd position in the 2nd rank of the 10th Legion was now working the door of an upscale brothel in the Suburra, breaking the arms of clients who refused to pay. A man who had operated a Scorpion ballista during Titus's siege of Jerusalem was now tracking down a merchant 2 streets over who had missed his protection payment and methodically breaking the specific small bones of the merchant's hand that would heal crooked. A man who had climbed the walls at Gamla under a rain of stones was now intimidating voters at a provincial election in a fishing town outside Ostia. They became the enforcers of the empire's underside. When a politician needed to rattle a rival in the week before the vote, he did not send loud, drunken bruisers. He sent the quiet men. The veterans moved through the narrow streets with the same formation discipline they had used in Gaul. They did not shout. They did not boast. They did not posture. They found the target. They cornered him. They did the work. They walked out. The beating was dispassionate, clinical. They broke the exact ankles and wrists necessary to guarantee the message stuck for life. They collected their silver. They went back to the popina and drank until they could not feel their faces. This was the true ending of the story, and it was the one no one in Rome wanted to tell. The Roman military had taken illiterate farm boys from the hills of Samnium and Campania and Umbria and carved them into the finest infantry the ancient world would ever produce. They had marched under the Golden Eagle. They had believed, at least at first, that they were bringing order and law and roads and aqueducts to the dark places of the world. Now they were the dark places. They were the terror of their own fellow citizens, paid in copper by the very crime bosses their younger selves would have arrested. They had become the barbarians. The irony was complete, and it was lethal to whatever was left of their minds. They drank heavier. They retreated further into themselves. And the Roman winter, which is nothing like the warm Mediterranean cliché, is a wet, bone-deep, killing cold that turns the alleys of the insulae into damp tombs. The cold seeped into the old fractures that had never set right. Respiratory infections moved through the tenement floors like a tide. Tuberculosis found a home in lungs that had breathed 20 years of campfire smoke and road dust. And so the old killers began to die. Not on a battlefield surrounded by brothers, not with a centurion calling their name. They died alone, coughing blood into straw mats, in rented cells that smelled of rot and urine and their own long-neglected bodies. Before they died, many of them performed one final eerie act of administration. It is, to this day, the most chilling piece of evidence in the archaeological record, and it survives in the ground by the thousands. A normal Roman citizen of any means belonged to a wide, interconnected family. When a civilian died, his family pooled their funds and commissioned a tombstone, carved by a local stonecutter, with a long dedication written by a relative. The inscription listed his ancestry, his loving wife, his devoted sons, his service to the municipal council, his generosity to the neighborhood. It described him as embedded in a living web of other people. The veterans had no web. They had no legal wives. Roman law forbade serving soldiers from marrying for the entire duration of their enlistment, which for most of imperial history was 20 to 25 years. Many of them had formed long, stable relationships with local women near the frontier forts. They had raised children with these women. But in the cold eye of Roman law, the women were concubines and the children were illegitimate. When the veteran died, no one came to claim the body. He knew that. He had known it for years. So, while he was still breathing, he walked to a stonecutter's shop with whatever silver he had left and paid the man to carve his own epitaph in advance. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of these stones out of the ground across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. They share a structure so consistent it is almost a genre. The veteran dictated the text himself. The stones begin, as all Roman tombstones do, with the traditional invocation, Dis manibus, to the spirits of the dead. But everything that follows is not a eulogy. It is a military service record, cold, clipped, administrative. Almost the paperwork of his own death. Name, legion, century, years of service. Campaigns survived. Titus Flavius of Legio Poedantif Gemina served 25 years, fought in Britain. That is the entire human life, compressed onto one slab. No mention of what he did after the discharge. No mention of a trade, a friendship, a woman, a belief, a moment of peace. No mention of what he loved. No mention of what he feared. Nothing. When a man knows he is about to die, he carves into permanent stone the single piece of his identity that he wants the future to remember him by. These men looked back across their entire life, every season, every meal, every dawn, every choice, and the only thing they found worth recording was the stretch of years during which they had been a state-owned killing tool. The civilian years did not count. The starving years did not count. The begging years did not count. The loneliness did not count. In their own minds, they had stopped being human beings on the morning they took the oath at 18. They had become weapons. And when the state finally put them down, they simply waited, without protest, without bitterness, without a wife beside them, to turn back into dust. Rome did not only conquer territories. Rome did not only extract grain from Egypt and silver from Hispania and slaves from Thrace. The empire's most precious raw material, and its most easily discarded one, was the sanity of its own men. Rome built the roads and the marble temples and the towering aqueducts you still visit on vacation, using as the binding mortar the pulverized minds of its lower-class sons. It engineered a perfect system for extracting 20 years of industrial violence from a human body and then dropping the emptied shell into a gutter, where the historians of the imperial court would make sure it was never mentioned again. The machine ran beautifully. It was efficient. It was cost-effective. It is still running today, under different flags, under different names, using different languages to promise different farms. And the bronze tablets are still, to this day, not being honored at the office window. Thank you for staying with me to the very end. If you want to keep these dark archives open, take 1 second right now to subscribe, hit like, and send this video to the one person in your life who needs to see what hides behind the marble statues. You have just finished another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Click the video currently surfacing on your screen to keep walking down into the past with us. Click it now. The descent is not finished.